out there, all you zany zebra longwings. Welcome to another episode of A Little Greener podcast, all about nature, conservation, and sustainability. I am one of your hosts. My name is Sarah, and I am joined by the not usually very zany Casey. Lovely to see you.
It was great to see you too. That was like a very specific, so I appreciate the stretch for it.
Listen, that is the state butterfly of Florida.
No way.
So what I pick my favorite butterfly species like I pick my favorite bird species, ones that are easily identifiable to me.
That is a good one.
That
yeah.
is one of them.
Now I'm looking up if my state has a butterfly. Oh, official state butterflies. Okay, netscape.com.
That sounds very reliable.
Yeah, right. According to this, most places don't have a state butterfly. Okay, I guess I'm gonna have to lobby for one because I know what our state amphibian is. It's the hellbender. So, all right, I'm gonna have to pick a cool one. That brings us to a little bit of topic. Sarah, last episode, we talked about mosquitoes.
Yeah.
Do you have any updates about mosquitoes?
I looked up mosquitoes in Florida, and apparently we have over 80 species of mosquito, which sounds terrible. And I didn't save it. I should have, or I'll have to look it up again. But to just combine our last couple of episodes, whatever the AI summary, Google summary was when I Googled mosquitoes was just terrible. It's like Florida has over 80 different species of mosquitoes that carry deadly diseases and whatever. It was
Google's
funny.
AI is wild. It needs to be perfected. But I'm sure then if you expand it would just be like
right.
Spelled out.
But I did not look up all of the species, but certainly some of the ones that we talked about in that mosquito episode, the yellow fever mosquito and the Asia tiger mosquito that I think we had a discussion about both here in Florida, as well as lots of others apparently. Who knew?
They love it warm, they love it wet, and what better place?
True. I also, just speaking on that real quick, I do have to say, since we talked about eradicating mosquitoes in that episode, I would change my tune a little bit if we were, I think I was thinking about mosquitoes as a whole. I would be more in favor of targeting a specific species of mosquito for eradication if we could make it that specific, not so much thinking about wiping out the entire thing. So I think that wasn't really processing in my brain when we were talking. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Hey, if you haven't listened to that mosquito episode, we talk a lot about mosquitoes and ethics behind and feasibility behind eradicating mosquitoes and conservation implications. So I had fun with that one. So I hope you guys will listen to that. Today, though, we're talking about some insects that maybe everybody feels a little bit happier about.
Yeah, less annoying insect for sure.
I do hope, I don't know how our listeners feel about an interview versus a standard episode, but please, even if interviews normally aren't your type, stick around for this one. We just had a delightful time with Dr. Vaughn Shirey, who is a butterfly scientist.
It was so fun.
Yeah, I think that he brought some awesome optimism and let us know really the current state of research and just some very cool elements we got into.
And also, just have to point out that in the course of that discussion, we also referenced multiple other topics that we have episodes on.
Yes.
So if you haven't listened already, you can also, after you listen to this fantastic interview, you can check out our episodes on artificial intelligence, on the insect apocalypse, and there was one more that we referenced. That's going to escape my brain now. That's all right. Those were a couple of big ones that we talked about. So check out those back episodes as well.
Yeah, we're going to listen to this podcast. We're going to figure out what the other one is, but check out our back catalog. Check out some of our other interviews because we've interviewed some very cool people. But this one was special to me because it's someone that I grew up with. So it ended up being even better than I was expecting. So appreciate Vaughn coming on the pod. And I really hope you guys will give the rest of this episode a listen because it's about butterflies. Hello, everyone. We are here for the main section of our podcast episode today. We are going to be talking to Dr. Vaughn Shirey. A little background for you. Vaughn and I went to school together. We went to high school together, and he then attended Drexel University, graduating with a degree in environmental science, and recently got his doctorate with his thesis focusing on population and community level changes in cold adapted butterfly populations. He will soon be starting as the assistant curator of Lepidoptera at the McGuire Center of Lepidoptera and Biodiversity at the Florida Museum of Natural History in the Shirey Global Change Lab. Vaughn, did I pronounce Lepidoptera right?
You did. It's fantastic.
Already starting with a win. Ella, excellent.
Yay. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for coming on the pod.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is so awesome and exciting.
So, Vaughn, we went to a school where I don't feel like there was a lot of infrastructure really like gearing us to set us up for a career path towards conservation. Like we didn't have a lot of established clubs. There's pretty limited classes that were available. So I was wondering what got you interested in pursuing a career in environmental science and conservation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I didn't start off as a conservation biologist or in a conservation career. I actually wanted to be a software engineer, which is kind of the opposite of what you might think. But I was really always interested in information, and I think there's no better way to really talk about information than to talk about it in the context of service for other people. And so my first job in high school was I worked in a public library, actually, in town. And I really saw that information in service of others. And so I always loved biology. I always loved information and computer science. And so I wanted to kind of combine those things for a career.
I love that like connection to the library too. Libraries are so hugely underrated. So that's super cool to think about that in launching you towards that. So with going towards conservation, how did you segue into butterflies?
Yeah, so kind of related to libraries too. I changed my major after my freshman year at Drexel, and I started volunteering at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, which is actually the oldest natural history museum in this hemisphere. And I walked into the collection and saw all the specimens there, and I was like, oh, this is the information I've been waiting to use, And so I think there's no better organism in terms of insects to talk about conservation work than butterflies, because they're like the group that people usually aren't afraid of when we bring up insects. Like they're okay to talk about at a party, I always say. And they're just beautiful. I think like we are naturally attracted to them for a variety of reasons. And so they have the best information for looking at insect responses to global climate change, to pesticides. And they're also just like stunning organisms in themselves.
I'm enjoying this so much already. So for going back to the first thing you said, talking about using information in the service of others, that is the best thing that I've ever heard. I love that so much. And I love that that was sort of your goal, that you were like, I mean, information, I think some people like information just to have information. And so for you to recognize that you wanted not just to have the information, but to be able to do something with it. Oh, that's so beautiful. So thank you for that. And then, yes, as a person who has worked in conservation education and talked a lot about insects to the general public, butterflies and ladybugs, those are the sort of gateway insects, I feel like, to try to get people interested. So I absolutely agree with you there. So we have had a couple of podcast episodes that we've done related to insects in various ways. We've talked about some specific species. We've also talked kind of broadly about insect conservation and some of the challenges with that. Insects are small animals. They have huge populations. They have very broad ranges. They can be difficult to identify. Finding the funds to get people to support insect conservation, there's a whole bunch of challenges that are associated with this. So what, for you, this is what you do. What have you found to be the most challenging about researching insect populations through the course of your work?
Oh, that's a great question. There are so many challenges. I would say, and you guys may have already talked about sort of this idea of the insect apocalypse or global insect decline. I would say that in insect ecology and insect conservation work, we don't even have baseline data. Like, we don't know what the insect populations were like in the 1970s, let alone farther back than that, right? And so natural history collections provide the best resource for sort of doing those reconstructions. But as you can imagine, like, insects are really hard to monitor over space and time. Like, they're not like large mammals where we can put like GPS collar on them and look at movements, right? And their numbers, like a lot of species really fluctuate between years in terms of their abundance. And so it can be challenging if you're saying, okay, 1970 is our baseline year. Well, what if that was a really great year for a given insect, right? And now we're comparing everything to this really great year. Are we overinflating declines? Are we underestimating declines? And so I think those are all really pressing challenges that we have. And I think there's also a social challenge. So I talked about, butterflies being this great, gateway animal to insects, as you mentioned, but there's a lot more insect species out there that unfortunately don't have that level of charisma. Thinking that every 1 in 4 animals is a beetle, right? And yet we're not really talking about that group at all, I think, in a lot of conservation spaces. And so I really would say that those are the 2 core challenges for insect conservation: is the sort of lack of knowledge still about baselines, natural history, and then sort of the social ick that people have when it comes to anything that's not a butterfly.
Casey, maybe we need to start doing a bug of the week.
Yes.
It would take us into eternity.
Right.
Well,
yeah.
but we don't have to hit them all, but like, let's help do some of that legwork to.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, hey, fireflies are great gateways to beetles, for example. I was wondering, just based on that answer, are there any sort of factors that you can kind of use to extrapolate some data off of? Like, do we look at historical data like, oh, the locusts came and ate our crops this year, or things like that? Or is that just so unreliable that we really can't make any sort of assumptions off of any sort of other interactions they're having?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, kind of 2 answers to that. Those historical specimens in museums are the best data that we have, but they're not collected in sort of like a structured survey sort of way. And so we have to account for like all of the factors that came to land that insect in the collection. So that's like people's personal interest, where people were collecting, where they weren't collecting, things of that nature. And so I do a lot of my work focusing on sort of the math of dealing with that. The other thing that's of particular interest now, which I think is really cool, is using AI tools to get some of those data out of historical literature. So looking at things that have been published back to the 1700s about, let's say crop pests, for example, and really extracting that data and then processing that data in a way that it can be used in, more statistical models to say something about, oh, well, in the 1700s, this species was reported as really common. And now we only have like 1 or 2 records of it, on this platform called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or in iNaturalist, for example. And so we can start to try to like meld those 2 kind of data types together.
That's so fascinating. We just did a podcast episode on AI.
Cool.
And so that was actually one of the questions, because I was looking at your research and I sort of knew from, being Facebook friends that you were studying butterflies. But I think what I came to realize over actually reading your papers is that you're really looking at the way we collect and analyze information in a lot of cases. And you've applied that to things outside of butterflies. It looked like there was maybe some bird studies in there as well. And that's something that the Shirey lab is going to be looking at, is utilizing AI techniques. Is it all historical data, or is it how are we using AI today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll preface this question by saying like a degree in ecology is basically a degree in applied math.
Okay.
And
Oh,
so most of the day I'm just thinking about math. And so I think, AI has a ton of power for historical data. So right now, what we're doing is we're using computer vision to accelerate the digitization of those museum specimens so that we can get those publicly available for scientists to use online. And that's been really expedited by large language models, tools like ChatGPT, where we can actually upload a photo and say, extract this information for me and put it in a nice table. And that way we sort of cut out someone having to sit there and type that information by hand. I've also done some AI on more contemporary data sources. So I'm sure you're familiar with iNaturalist and platforms like that. And so one of the really cool things that me and a lot of other folks are thinking about is, okay, you've taken this picture of, let's say, a bee, and iNaturalist has identified this bee, but you can also extract a lot of other information from that photo as well. What color is the flower that the bee is on, for example? Are there any other bees in the picture? What was the weather like that day? Things of that nature. And so right now we're exploring how to use computer vision to sort of extract all this cool associated information from photographic data as well.
That's so cool.
it is really cool. I'm gonna have to start changing my tune on AI a little bit. Darn it.
We definitely need some examples of how it's like positive. But I love hearing that sort of thing because I work at a garden center now, and today it was a beautiful day, and it was really one of the first days that I felt overwhelmed in a good way about the amount of insects that I was seeing
Nice.
compared to even just a couple of weeks ago. I was like, where are you guys? Like, is this a bad
Right.
year for you? I'm worried.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of fun running around and taking my photos
Nice. Nice.
of the bees going and all the different flowers and things. So that is a very cool application of being able to use data that people aren't necessarily intending to collect. Like they're intending to collect the one piece of data, but being able to like partner that with so much more data is really cool.
Yeah, I think it's only going to grow. I mean, the volume of data that's coming in from iNaturalist right now is like exponential. And I think, I mean, there's ways that I can't even conceptualize of how we can use this data in the future, especially with some of these AI tools.
My brain hurts like all of this. It makes my brain hurt a little bit. So I can't even conceptualize what it is that you do. It's very impressive to me. So I'll let Casey ask the hard-hitting science questions.
Awesome.
I'm gonna back up a little bit here, and I'm just curious to know from you, like what has been your, I don't know if the favorite project is the right word, or favorite topic that you've gotten to research, or favorite thing that you've worked on. And do you have any favorite species, butterfly or otherwise, that you've gotten to work on or study?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So, favorite project, I think I recently published this work on boreal and Arctic butterflies in North America and climate change. That's a favorite, mostly because I didn't think that it was a high risk project, I'll say that.
Okay.
These we were dealing with one of the most undersampled areas of the continent, and we wanted to look at 50 years of how the butterfly communities were shifting in response to climate change. And so we did some fancy math in the paper, which I won't get into, but it turned out that we were extracting a very coherent signal of decline in these cold adapted species and an increase of the southern species that were starting to sort of eke their way northward towards the pole as they track their sort of thermal limits with climate change. And so that was the first analysis, really, of what's going on, at the Canadian border and above. And I hope that it really inspires some conservation assessments of those species and some renewed attention to the butterflies up there, because they don't get a lot of attention. They're not tropical species. They're not the brightest, most colorful butterflies, but they are uniquely threatened by some of the most rapid climate change on the planet. And so I hope that work, it's my favorite because I really want to like kind of be an advocate for those quote unquote ugly butterflies that people aren't looking at because they're not the prettiest. Favorite species? I do have a favorite species of butterfly. The scientific name is Nymphalis antiopa. It's the morning cloak, which you may be familiar with. And I love this species because I think it has a really good sort of folklore to it. And so the species overwinters as adults. So it's often one of the first butterflies you'll see in the spring. Gorgeous sort of like maroon purple color. And then the border is sort of this gold accent on the wing margin. And the story behind the species, and it's called mourning cloak, mourning in the sense of like a funeral. The story behind the species is there's two versions of the story depending on what flavor you want to take. But the story is that the mourning cloak represents a widow, and she is in mourning because her husband has died, and so she's wearing sort of this mourning shawl. That's this black, deep maroon color on the wings. But depending on the version that you want to take, the positive version is that there is hope and brightness on the horizon for her. And so that gold on the edge represents sort of the optimism and renewal of her life. And so it kind of ties into that whole first butterfly in spring sort of thing. The bad version of the story is that
Yeah, let's hear if you're drama.
yeah, here's where the drama comes in. Is that she's actually sort of a black widow, and that she had killed her husband for the life insurance money, and the gold represents the riches on the horizon, which may also coincide with some optimism on her behalf. But those are the two versions of sort of the mourning cloak folklore.
I love that you used a spider metaphor for your butterfly description with the
Yeah. Well, I used to work with spiders, so those are my two favorite groups.
As conservation educators, we like lock on to things like that. Like that was like, oh, I could tell that story.
Yeah.
I can make someone care about that butterfly because I'm going to remember that. That's so memorable.
I have to go back. I'm sorry, I'm going rogue, Casey. I do have to go back to the cold weather butterflies.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, so you said this was your favorite project, so please tell us a little more about it, because I don't think of butterflies as animals that live in cold places.
Yeah.
So, and you say like they're not as familiar to people. Can you give us a little bit, like, are there a lot of these kinds of butterflies? How are they adapted for the cold weather? Can you give us just a glimpse into these butterflies?
Totally. Yeah. So there's not a lot of these butterflies, as you can imagine. So butterflies like it hot and humid. That's why there's a lot of them in the tropics. These butterflies in North America, thinking of sort of like the high Arctic, actually from the Canadian border up, is probably about 90 species of butterfly.
It's still more than I like. I know that's not a lot, relatively speaking, but that is more than I would have thought.
Yeah, so for context, in the United States, there's about 750 species of butterfly. Globally, there's about 20,000, which is about twice the number of currently described bird species in the world. And we won't even go into moths because you have to multiply butterflies by 10 to get to moth diversity. So, but these cold adapted species, they're really fascinating. They're often in like a few genera, and so they look very similar, and they're well adapted to sort of these cold environments through a whole bunch of different adaptations. One of them that's really important is actually how melanized they are, and so that can be really important for thermoregulation. So as ectotherms, these butterflies need to rely on sort of ambient environmental temperature to warm up and fly. And the melanin basically absorbs solar radiation and redirects that energy as thermal energy to their flight muscles. And so a lot of these butterflies will be black or brown or gray. They'll have a lot of melanin sort of concentrated around their bodies to absorb as much sunlight as possible. Some species, and I think that this is more tested in moths, but Some species have antifreeze compounds that allow them to overwinter. And so that's sort of what they're spending all of their metabolic time generating, as they're eating their host plant. And another thing that is really fascinating about snow, and snow is a whole topic that we could talk hours about, is the fact that snow is actually a really nice blanket for butterflies. And so one of the concerns is that as you have less and less snowfall, you're losing that blanket. And so that little area between the snow and the soil is actually warm enough for butterflies to survive the winter. And so if you don't have that blanket, they're getting essentially exposed, freezing temperatures and winds. And so with changing precipitation patterns in the Arctic and Boreal from snowfall to rainfall, that's one of the primary things that we're concerned about for species up there.
My works with turtles. That's his area of specialization, and that's also something that turtle scientists have to look at, because that's how a lot of like box turtles survive the wintertime, is they just go right below the leaf litter and they're counting on snow to stop themselves from freezing. So just definitely impacts across the animal communities in that area. When I mentioned to him that you were working on like boreal butterflies, I think everybody I said that to was like, that's a thing. So I'm glad we get to talk a little bit about that. Are there a lot of people working on that, or is that like something that's sort of being piloted by people you worked with in this project?
Yeah, so there's quite a few people working on it. Not as much as I would say in the tropics, where most butterfly scientists tend to focus their time. So I have a great colleague, Jamie Luthwaite, who's working on doing some assessments for Canadian species. She's Canadian, so she's hoping to get some of these species listed under SARA, which is sort of the equivalent to their Endangered Species Act in Canada. And then Federico Riva also did some work on boreal forest cut lines and how those can actually sort of counterintuitively promote butterfly diversity, because you're opening up the canopy for wildflowers and butterfly movement in these areas.
In those areas, do you guys, is this something that would feature a lot in like local indigenous knowledge as well, or is this something that just hasn't been super well documented?
That's a great question. So in the before COVID times, I did some field work up in southwestern Yukon territory, and you kind of have to be careful with that kind of work, because there are stories that are to be shared and stories that are not to be shared, right? But from my knowledge, there hasn't been stories shared with me or that I've been able to find about butterflies in particular. A lot of the stories focus on sort of these larger quote unquote game animals. But butterflies across cultures are somewhat, I guess, eerily considered a symbol of the soul, like across continents, across cultures. And so I think there might be something there in terms of, indigenous knowledge.
I'm going to transition a little bit from talking about the butterflies to talking about the data. So Casey was telling me that one of the papers that you've worked on is looking at the impact of citizen science on data and things like iNaturalist and all of that information that's just coming from people. So how has that been a benefit for you? And also, are there any drawbacks or challenges that come along with citizen science?
Yeah, that's a great question. So both. You get sort of both worlds there. I am absolutely sort of enamored by this participatory science data. In terms of how we're doing insect biodiversity monitoring, I think that there's currently no substitute for just the volume of data that is coming in on platforms like iNaturalist. That's really great, and I would emphatically support sign up for iNaturalist. If you haven't already, please start taking pictures of all the little things in your backyard, because those data do get used by scientists to inform conservation. The drawback of those data is that we're not giving people a protocol to go out and survey those things. And so one of the big things in ecology is how much effort did you actually spend trying to look for something? Because if you spend 1 minute trying to look for a butterfly versus, 1 hour, chances are you're going to encounter that butterfly in 1 hour than 1 minute, right? And we don't have that information with iNaturalist at all. And so what we have is a whole bunch of people randomly contributing records, and we have to sort of sift through the noise to get at the ecological signal of that, which I think we're getting pretty close to being able to do very efficiently. But yeah, the lack of sort of a structured protocol or like people making checklists is definitely something that people have to contend with.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm glad to hear you say it because I love, once again, from the conservation educator side, I love encouraging people to use iNaturalist, use their Seek app,
Yeah.
all of those things. It's just such a great way to help people feel connected, to
Mhm.
get kids out there and exploring, and you want people to feel like not only are they feeling connected, but are they feeling like they are making a difference
Right.
in some way. So it's nice to hear that. But yeah, it is. I can definitely see where the drawbacks would be. And it just, as you were talking, it just made me wonder, like, I've done frog watch before, like the frog monitoring where there is a little more
Mhm.
of I mean, you're still having to trust people
Right.
that they are doing what they're saying that they're doing. But at
Yeah.
least there you do have a form. You're writing the time that you were out there. You're making note of weather conditions and things like that. I wonder if there's a way that we could like boost my
Yeah.
naturalist to somehow have a little more
So
kind of protocol.
I'll just make a plug for eButterfly. Yes.
I didn't know
Okay.
this was
So
a
let me
thing.
tell you about
Okay,
eButterfly.
please.
So eButterfly is, if you've heard of eBird, that's sort of an app where people make checklists of birds that they've seen. eButterfly doesn't have an app yet, but I'm hoping that they'll make one in the coming years. But it's basically eBird, but for butterflies. So you can actually go out and record your effort while you're observing butterflies. And so it will provide us that like structured data.
Does it have a so are you saying though then like if you go out and you see a butterfly, do you have to identify it?
So right now, I think so, but I know that they're working on AI to sort of tackle that through like, oh, you can take a photo similar to how you would on iNat.
Okay. Yeah, because I mean those are the pros and cons, I guess, because with Frogwatch you did have to self-identify like the things that
Right.
you were hearing, and I was always so terrified every time I did it that I was getting it wrong. So it is, that's where the iNaturalist is nice for
Yeah.
us amateurs out here.
Yeah. And
So yeah.
I think they'll have folks that are curating it. I mean, I wanted to contribute an eBird checklist for so long, and I was using their app Merlin to do it, which
Mhm.
does like the
Love
audio
Merlin.
AI. And I had set my location, it was still set to like California or something. So like it was giving me the totally wrong birds. And I made the eBird checklist, and I actually got an email from someone at eBird that was like, "Hi, it's not possible for
These
you
are
to
wrong.
have seen this bird." And so I think eButterfly might institute like the same thing.
Yeah.
Like a
Love
location seeking. Yeah. Dr. Robert Mittermeier, who's actually a herpetologist and primatologist, has talked about instituting like primate life lists similar to how birders do
Oh,
it.
yeah.
But I think butterflies is actually such a better venue for that because there's so many more accessible in a local area. Like I would love to have a life list for seeing wild primates. It's currently at zero
Right.
because I live in the US in the north. But butterflies, man, that would be very cool. Actually saw I think it ended up being an eastern tailed blue
Okay,
butterfly
yeah.
on my Heliopsis the other day, and it was the first
Right.
time I ever saw it. And it was so striking. I had to immediately Google it, but I would have loved to be able to be like, check it off my list.
Right.
So yeah, no, that sounds like a pick worth going to. Like as conservation educators, we're always gravitating towards things that make people feel empowered.
Mhm.
One of the drawbacks I have seen cited about citizen science projects, maybe more focused at things like iNaturalist versus maybe things that are a little bit more structured, but
Mhm.
that there are some disparities between the people who use some of these apps. And because sometimes they do factor into conservation science and funding, that you're going to have historically underserved areas underrepresented and therefore receive less of the funding for things like habitat restoration. Is that something that you feel like factors into your work as butterflies so far? Or is it just something you guys kind of keep in your mind?
It's definitely something to be cognizant of. And so I have a good friend who's actually in the same fellowship program as me, Diego Ellis Soto, who works on sort of the redlining and bias in iNaturalist data in sort of these underserved communities. For me, I'm fortunate that a lot of my stuff is so macro scale that it kind of goes out in the wash for the most part. Because we're talking about like kilometers of like spatial analysis, but it is definitely a problem at landscape and local scales. Like you can see it if you go on iNaturalist right now and look up Philadelphia and you look up pair that with a redlining map of Philadelphia, it will be night and day. Like you will not see any iNaturalist records, or very few in some of these areas that have been underserved and marginalized. And you will see a ton of records around universities and like city parks and things like that. And so I think in the context of understanding how the urban environment impacts things like insect conservation, we definitely need to take those things into account. Otherwise, I wouldn't necessarily trust a lot of the inferences that come out based on that bias data.
Have to put in a pretty big math equation for
Yes, big math. Yeah.
So, in your new position, which I'm so excited to have you coming down here to the Sunshine State, you're going to be researching insects, of course, but you are also going to be looking at actionable conservation outcomes. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and what you've seen coming from your work so far?
Yeah, so one of the things I've been really frustrated about in sort of the academic sphere is that we do all this math, fancy math, and then we publish the paper, and then like blah. Not much really comes from it, and sometimes it feels like screaming to like my friends who are in this echo chamber with me, you know? And so I've been really, really frustrated by that. And so looking ahead to, arriving in Florida, probably one of the biggest agricultural states aside from California, is really trying to tie those things to how we manage ecosystems on the ground. And so one of the things that I'm really excited to dive into in Florida in particular is not just these aspects of like coastal development, sea level rise, things of that nature, which in some ways are these bigger existential problems that are often hard or require like really big social movements to address. I want to focus on non-target pesticides and the impacts that those non-target pesticides have on butterfly communities in Florida and North America more generally. And I think that's actionable because, and I would love to partner with actually industry on this, because I don't want to say to growers, you cannot use these at all. I think one of the problems that conservation has suffered from and has sort of gotten some backlash about is saying, no, 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 you can't do this, right? I'm really interested in using AI to explore how we can actually optimize how growers are using pesticides on their land to maximize their yields, which is really important to support, their families, but also maximize biodiversity in the region as well. And so those are things that I'm hoping to action through my science and work through the extension offices at University of Florida to do.
That's super cool work because we don't do a lot of growing on grounds where I work, but we do manage a lot of inventory.
Mm-hmm.
And it's mostly ornamentals, but we do some veggie crops and things like that. And we've recently really tried to dive into integrated pest management.
Yeah.
Finding that our every pesticide on our shelves weren't getting rid of our mealybugs, like it just wasn't working. And so we consulted our extension office at Penn State and we had one of their experts come out for free, and she was able to like give us her greenhouse management book. And so I think that there's an appetite for that in that industry. It is just trying to like form those relationships so that it in some ways feels too good to be true that not putting poison onto things would work as well as,
Right.
doing that. And in other ways, it does have like a cost barrier. Like there are
Yeah.
certain things. So I'm interested to see how this AI sort of informs how we might be able to give everyone the tools to their individual growing situations because they're so different. Like ours is a lot smaller scale than what the recommended dosage for different things are. So
Yeah.
that sounds like a really cool project. Are you looking mostly at the agricultural sector, or do you think about things like horticulture or golf courses or things like that are like large land areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think all of the above. The what I'm planning to do is sort of set up sort of passive monitoring of pesticides in habitats that are adjacent to these agricultural fields or these golf courses, and then survey butterflies at the same time. And so we'll pair that ambient chemical data with the butterfly surveys for caterpillars, for adults, and get a sense of across a large landscape which pesticides are associated with declines in butterfly biodiversity, which ones seem to be okay, and then also relay that information back to the use case, right? So the same pesticides that are applied to citrus groves are not necessarily the same pesticides applied to cabbage, for example, right? And so looking at these sort of multi-objective spaces where you're trying to optimize like all of these different outcomes is definitely a task that I think AI can handle because it's good at sifting through like these complex issues.
Oh, so I think you have boosted Sarah and I's optimism on
Yes.
Great.
our AI robotic
Well,
overlords of the future.
so many things you've boost. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I don't want to say boost my confidence yet, but you've boosted my understanding and appreciation of what AI can do for us. That's positive. But also, I will say that you have honestly just boosted my confidence in humanity. Is that too broad of a thing to say? No, I just really appreciate what you've shared and how you've shared it too. I mean, even just this idea just right now of looking at the different stakeholders involved and trying to understand what they need and their points of view, but getting the data that is going to help them to do so at a lesser cost to the environment. Like I think that's such a good attitude and such a good approach. And I just feel really positive about things right now.
That's great. I'll just say, like, I think I recently guest lectured on sort of the motivating philosophies of conservation biology through time. And there's sort of like going from nature for itself to like nature, what can nature do for us, ecosystem services, then nature despite us, so like monkey wrench gang kind of stuff, and then nature with us. And I think with us doesn't just mean like us and nature, but it means us with each other too. And I don't think that we can like action conservation without talking to growers, without talking to policymakers, because then we're just talking to ourselves, and that's not this, overarching concept of a shared planet to me.
100%. And I think that's also like a little bit of our where politics has to come into it and, have some sort of political will. You have to have buy-in from all of the stakeholders. So all of a sudden it becomes something that like in the 70s when they're passing things like the Endangered Species Act, it's because that's what the overwhelming majority wanted.
Right.
It wasn't convincing, it
Right.
was like, no, we want clean air, we want clean water, and having something that's like, we want a world that has butterflies in it.
Yes.
We want to be alongside like, healthy ecosystems is definitely worth connecting with all possible impacted areas for.
Yeah, and I think like I just going back to sort of that era of environmental legislation, I'm sure you've talked about this before, is like those three bills had some of the most bipartisan support of any bill in this nation's history. And so I really think returning to an era of that is like my ideal.
Yeah, it doesn't it feels so divorced from so
Yeah.
many other things that might divide us. I think that if we really looked at it on a micro scale, all of us, that I should say, there are very few people who
Yeah.
would identify themselves as anti-nature. They might
Right.
say like, I'm not pro-nature in the cost of business, but we all start in a very similar place, which is that it would be nice to have a planet that's inhabitable for lots of different creatures. So, yeah, and I appreciate that, like, as a scientist, I feel like sometimes scientists get accused of like being biased because they are actually the most informed people on their subjects. But I like that you like lean into like actually this data means something, and it ties back to your motivating feature in the beginning of this episode, which is using data for good in service of, humanity, nature, etc. And so yeah, that's really inspiring, Vaughn.
Oh, thank you. I just want us all to be like happy and like in the forest walking together. That's
There's
my
just
end
like a
goal.
tie-dye motif behind
Exactly.
you, a
Yes.
little morning
Yeah.
cloak.
Harry granola, you know.
Oh man. So truly, Vaughn, this has been delightful. Thank you so much for chatting with us. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for the work that you do. Is there anything that we missed? Is there anything that you really wanted to share about your work, or something that you really need people to know about butterflies or insects or anything in spiders before we wrap up here?
Yeah, I kind of like to end on this point, and this is something that working on insects has really brought to the forefront of my mind is, when you're out in nature, noticing the little things is really important. Spending time, even if it's just 5 minutes of your day, to sit with and like watch what a butterfly is doing as it's, going about its day is something that I think a lot of us can do and would help a lot of people connect with nature more.
This is going to tie into our last question for you then, because I have to say on our last episode, right, Casey, that was your challenge for the episode, was to go spend some time in nature, because we talked about mosquitoes,
Yes,
right?
thank you.
I
was like, I don't remember.
We talked about mosquitoes, and you encouraged us to get outside and be a little more observant of some insects. And I was away for the weekend, and we went to some gardens. I took so many bee and butterfly pictures
Nice.
over the weekend, getting my challenge in. So there you go. And so with that said, Vaughn, we do try to give our listeners a challenge every episode, just some way for them to get involved with the topic in their daily lives, to take one step to help us all be a little greener. So we maybe just stole your easy
No.
challenge, because we just did that last time. But would you be willing and able to give a challenge to, it can be as big as or as small as you want, but just something to give our listeners to try to work into their life here?
Yeah, would it be appropriate to give two challenges?
Yes.
Do it.
Okay,
Always.
perfect. Challenge number one, which is probably the easier challenge. Sign up for iNaturalist right now. Do it right now and start contributing records.
Pull over. Pull
Yes.
your car to the side of the road safely.
Be safe.
Yes. Yeah,
Download
no
it.
eye-natting while driving, please.
Absolutely.
Do that. I
That
don't
needs
think
to
your
be on a bumper
pictures,
sticker.
the pictures won't be good quality either. So, that's challenge number one. iNat safely and responsibly, please. Challenge number two, and we didn't talk about this, but I just want to highlight it, is this fall, when you are raking your leaves, leave your leaves on your lawn.
Yes.
Do not dispose of your leaves, because that is such a critical habitat for overwintering moths, for overwintering butterflies, and it's honestly one of the best things you can do for insects, especially around here. So, and I don't care if your HOA says you can't do it. Do it anyway.
Join
We'll
the
go
board of your
yeah.
HOA and change the rules.
We'll go to
Exactly.
bat for you. Play this episode for your HOA.
There you
Or-
go.
Exactly. So that's my hard challenge.
No, I love that. And it saves you work, man.
Yeah.
This is one of my favorite things. I love things that help the planet, that make me have to do less work.
Right. Me
So-
too.
Change a little social norms. It's okay. Leave the leaves. Vaughn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. This was amazing.
It's been a pleasure to have you. If our folks want to see your work, where could they do that?
Yes, right now you can go to vmshirey.github.io. That's my website.
It'll be in the show notes.
Or find me on Google Scholar or Instagram, Vaughn.Shirey, or Twitter, vmshirey. I tweet a whole bunch of things. So yeah, see you there.
Here we go. And if you have any questions, any feedback showing us your challenge outcomes, showing us that you're doing what the good butterfly scientist tells you what to do, Sara, where can they share that with us?
You can find us on Facebook at A Little Greener Podcast. We're still in Instagram jail, so don't message us there. But you can also email us at alittlegreenerpodcast@gmail.com, so you can send us all of your butterfly and other insect photos or whatever else you want. We're always happy to hear from you.
All right, guys. Vaughn, thanks for being here. Sara, thanks for being the best. And we'll talk to you guys next time.
You too, Casey. Thanks for listening, everyone. Bye.